Hi everybody, hope you're doing marvelously well. In this episode, we're going to discuss whether you should be mixing in stereo, mixing in mono, mixing one channel at a time. What should you be doing? This is a question I get asked many times a day. So I hope you're all doing marvelously well. Of course, as ever, if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell and you will be subscribed and notified whenever we have videos. You can also go to producelikeapro.com, sign up for the email list, get a whole bunch of free goodies. You can also check out the Academy. Okay, so this is a ridiculously huge question. There are so many videos on this subject. You'll notice that all of the big mixers that we, all consider to be fantastic, all say that they don't actually mix in mono, but they check in mono. So we're going to do that as well. We're going to see why, working in mono can be useful. Also, we're going to check listening to one side at a time. We're going to talk about all of the benefits, all the pitfalls, and all the advantages in all of the kind of things. Let me first say, I mix in stereo, but I check in mono when I hear issues. I don't spend my whole life like checking in mono, because quite frankly, I've been doing this a very long time. And when something has phase polarity issues, it's a little dizzying, to hear two channels that don't seem to lock out and the center seems to be disappearing. That's something that's quite immediate for me, but I will check in mono, especially when it comes to a couple of things that we're going to talk about now. We have a plugin here made by our good friends, Brainworks, and it is free. And you can do a couple of things here. If we play the mix, you can listen to the left hand only, the right hand only, and then with this control, you can use it to increase stereo width, but if you go full left, you have mono. And a couple of other nice features is you can listen to just the middle source only and then the sides in solo. So let's have a listen to those. And then the sides. And one last feature is swapping left and right. Which, believe it or not, is a very, very useful tool. What I like about that swap feature is many, many times I've gone into studios where they don't have small monitors in front of the screen like we do. We have a pair of little IKs tucked away there, which you can use for editing and stuff like that. And then when you come to mix, you can go and sit between a pair of big speakers and crank it up if necessary. I've been in many, many studios where that is not a reality. So often I'm like mixing and spinning around backwards and forwards. And the inevitability in that situation is my left ear gets blown out. It's this left-hand side is hearing stuff super, super loud. And I was once in a recording session. It will remain nameless, but it was a big band, big producer, big engineer. I wasn't the assistant, but I was the second engineer on it. And the engineer was convinced that the left-hand side was slightly down. And the assistant was saying, "Are you sure it's not because you've got the screen here?" And no matter what we did to convince him, we brought in text and stuff like that. And this was quite a long time ago. And if we'd simply just been able to hit this button here, he would have heard the difference between his left and right. I don't know if it still would have then stubbornly agreed with us, but he was very stubborn. But my point is, it's a great feature. Your hearing can be uneven. You could be, riding on your bicycle to the studio and some huge truck goes by. All kinds of things can happen and you can get a little bit of tiny high-frequency cut that's uneven. It does happen when you're in loud environments for sustained periods of time. So it's a nice feature to just be able to swap it and compare. I do it all the time. Frankly, without that plugin, I just do this. But my point is like if something seems a little dull on one side, I will immediately flip them around because maybe the headphones are down one side. And if it transfers over, it could have been the fact that, the headphone, the high end is losing. So great little feature. Let's talk about stereo mono mixing. Now, I like, in principle, the idea of mixing in mono. I don't honestly feel like I need to mix in mono to get balances. I don't feel like I do. However, back in the late 60s, early 70s, as stereo started to really take root, especially in the 70s, early 70s, when, Dark Side of the Moon, albums like that, there was a thing with consoles where you had left, right, and mono. And the reason for that was when you would pan between it, there would actually be a volume difference between coming out of both speakers and then moving around. So a lot of people advocated working in mono for levels and then replicating that in stereo. Very complicated way of working, and I doubt if any of those kind of consoles even exist anymore. But there was always a reason. I asked a couple of older engineers why they worked in mono, then moved to stereo occasionally, and that was one of the reasons they gave me. They would print a reference mix in mono and then sort of replicate in a very naive kind of stereo way how they liked the balances. Sounds very complicated, but I suppose that's what people did. Here is the pluses and minuses. I've talked about this before, but I'll reiterate it. If we take, say, the drum sound here, the ambience is stereo from the snare, for instance. So if it's solo, no drum samples on this, all live drums. This is Glenn Fricker approved.
About freaking time.
Now you can hear the ambience of the snare around it. Let's go to mono. So with the BX, we just flick to mono here. You still hear it, but you don't hear it half as loud. The thing is with the ambience like that is quite often in stereo ambience is it can, by very nature, have little phase and polarity kind of issues which create width. Many people argue with consoles that each channel has ever so slightly different phase relationships. And when it comes to digital, that isn't possible. Everything is absolutely perfect. It's one of the reasons why Brainworks went out and modeled multiple channels of a console, so that when you open up, say, one of their SSL channel strips, you can actually choose it to be a different channel on the console. All of that ever so slight phase shift, tiny little phase shifts that you're going to get from that creates more width, more depth. In reality, it's little phase issues. So the stereo ambience in a room has those issues. It creates width. Folded back into mono, there's a little bit of cancellation, and it gets a little bit smothered by the mono signal. So we'll go back to mono. Put it in the stereo. It just feels louder. Rightly or wrongly, that is a reality. So let's listen to the drum mix in mono. You hear ambience. Let's go to stereo. Ambience is much, much huger. So one argument for mono and stereo would be, should you be getting your reverb set in mono? Let's think about this for a moment. We're set at +3 on my snare reverb here. So let's just stick a trim plugin on that so I can have something variable in real time. Let's just turn it up in mono. Put the whole mix together. So now in mono, I'm getting like that big snare, and I'm a little bit under +3 dB louder on the reverb. Let's go back to stereo. Bypass. It just seems like too much now. So it's kind of a catch-22. There are certain stereo effects that rely on differences in polarity, differences in phase to create width. And when it comes to things like stereo reverbs, that is part of what creates the stereo imagery, and it's okay. So when working in mono, be aware of that. Meaning what I would probably do if you want to try mixing in mono is mix everything in mono and don't do any verbs until afterwards, because you'll have a full sense of security of what you think the right level of reverb is. So there's a pro and a con with it. We'll go back and listen to those drums in mono again. Go to something with some tom fills. Another section here with tons of toms. Listen to that in stereo. Interesting. Back to mono. It's really weird. So in mono, I feel like that last tom hit seems to get lost. Because it's right over the kick. Because it's panned over the top of the kick. Let's go to stereo. There it's clear as day. I'm going to loop that. So this is in stereo, and then you're going to feel it in real time sweep into mono. And we'll do it a couple of times so you can compare. And you give me your opinion, but to me it seems like it's a downside of working in mono here, is that those tom that lands on the kick now seems too quiet. So should I push it up? Here's in stereo, and I'll sweep to mono. I mean, it's there, and I'm sure plenty of you say, oh, I can still hear the tom. You can hear it, but you don't hear it as clearly defined as when you're working in stereo. So that would be another confusing point, that I would turn that tom up. In fact, to be honest, all of those floor toms up, because some of the low end on that gets a little bit eaten by the kick. But I wouldn't go in there and spend hours like trying to like separate them perfectly from each other EQ wise and drawing like this weird, almost like jigsaw puzzle so they fit around. Maybe if I was doing like EDM or ultra metal and I wanted like all of this stuff to be so unbelievably loud. But in a relatively natural sounding drum kit like this, there's going to be overlap, and that's okay. So to me, that's another, thing to think about when you're working in mono and stereo. If you want to work in mono to balance things quickly, try it, but be aware that the relationship of things like toms, etc., which are panned away from snares, particularly floor toms, feel so much better when they're like, over here, away from the snare on the drum kit, rather than exactly over the top where maybe a kick is playing. These are very important things to know. Okay, so let's try a guitar here. Here's Chris's guitar. If we listen to just the left-hand side, you're going to hear predominantly Chris's dry guitar with 20% reverb. Pretty dry. Now, if we listen to just the right-hand side, you're going to hear predominantly the reverb with just a bit of Chris's dry guitar. Pretty loud reverb. Dry guitar. Reverb. So now we have it in stereo. Let's go and move it to mono. Here's stereo. Mono. Mute the reverb. So now we have no reverb playing. Bring the reverb back in. I mean, when you hear me stop it there and the reverb decay goes on, you really, oh yeah, I can hear the reverb. But when it's in there just subtly, it's like, yeah, you can hear it. But can you hear it like you can when you're working in stereo? No. So just to hammer home that point, if you want to work in mono, don't spend ages, setting all your reverbs and delays up, because if you're using them for stereo effects, you're going to end up pushing them too loud to get them to be audible, and then sort of, creating more work for yourself. The reality about working in mono is it's a good, fun tool. It's great for checking phase issues. So if we wanted to deliberately do something, say for instance, take Chris's guitar here, and this is deliberately stupid, and pan it opposite, and then invert the polarity. Then put it in mono, it all disappears. So this randomly weird guitar sound now, where one side is the polarity is flipped, the other side is there, put it into mono, it almost completely disappears. It's totally disconcerting to have two guitars wide like this that have got flipped polarity. There's lots of sounds in DAWs. For instance, a couple of years ago, somebody gave me a stereo bass sound, like a bass synth. You probably know it if you use Logic. It's called something like stereo bass. And all it was a left to right flipped, which is pretty much the worst thing you can do to a bass guitar or a bass synth. So you had this sort of weird, disconcerting kind of like low end coming out left and right with nothing out the middle, similar to what we just created here. And the only reason why this is not entirely phase cancelling is just the percentage of the panning. You know, if I was to do this, totally phase cancels in stereo. But people do these random kind of width things where they put the guitars, you know, wide and then slightly delay them for a house effect. The problem is like if they don't delay it enough, it causes all kinds of phase issues. Like I can put this polarity back now. So hopefully you're following this. I put the polarity back. I'm going to grab this guitar and I'm going to nudge it back ever so slightly. So it's not a full waveform back. Now listen to see what we got. So it makes the guitar feel a little bit wider. And people do that all the time. It's taught by YouTubers, the house effect. Now let's listen to it in mono. Dreadful. There's a mono source, one guitar. Bring the second one on. Feels like there's some kind of, well, phase shift. There's like a phaser on it. So that slightly out of time, slightly out of phase guitar just makes your mix feel really disconcerting. Where's it coming from? So much nicer with it not on. But that's a beauty of mono. You can flip it into mono and help you figure out, oh, what happened? Oh, the guitar sounds really weird. Or the guitar cancels out like it did earlier, almost entirely. So there are all kinds of reasons why using mono is really, really important for checking stuff. So let's just listen to the mix now, listening to the left and the right independently of each other. Here's the left-hand side. Here's the right. Together. Left again. Right only. Together. Left. So here's a downside of the left only and the right only. There, for instance, on that, here's the left. I listen to that and I'm thinking, oh, I need to automate the snare under some of those guitar parts because it's getting a little lost. I mean, there's a moment there, the snare feels like it disappears. Now let's listen to that same thing in stereo. I mean, it dips ever so slightly, but it doesn't disappear. It's because that guitar is probably, you know, it's loud. That left-hand guitar is like maybe 3 dB up where it should be in a mono source. But where it's only coming out predominantly out of one speaker, it sounds great because the snare drum is not only coming out the left-hand side, it's coming out the right-hand side. It's a combined signal. It feels louder. It's just kind of logic. You know, if we were to mix only on the left-hand side, I would turn that guitar down. Simple as that. I would now grab this guitar. Is it this one? Yeah, it is. It's too loud. Left-hand channel only. If I'm only going to mix left-hand channel, far too loud. Let's pull it down to where it works. Okay, so I've actually turned it up in that section. So let's bring this down to where it sounds great on just the one side only. So I've brought it down minus 5 dB. Let's have a listen. See how that feels. That's pretty close. We'll give it, we'll give it an extra dB. So we've come down 4 dB because we're only listening to the left-hand side. Perfect. All right. Is it though? Let's go back and listen in stereo. Why is that left-hand guitar too quiet now? Left-hand guitar is too quiet. It's really as simple as that. Only working on one side is like, what you're going to end up doing is getting everything like even on one perspective, but it's not going to give you what it's going to work in stereo. All of this is fine. It's just understanding why people work in stereo and then check in mono. I love the idea and the exercise of mixing in mono and then panning around. I see a lot of beginner channels teaching that. And I think it's probably worth, a video, me doing a video on mixing in mono. I think we could do that. We could do a whole video on how to mix in mono and the benefits of it. But I think just cutting to the chase it's an interesting concept, but the reality is like working in stereo, checking in mono, understanding where mono is a benefit is really, really huge. Thanks ever so much for watching. Please give us your experiences. I know not everybody's going to agree with this, and there's going to be lots of people that are going to say they mix in mono and stuff, and that's absolutely fine. I think that personally comes down to like how you've learned and how your brain focuses on it. I tend to, these days, after doing it for more years than I want anybody to know, is like I have a picture of how I want the song to sound, and I can go there and pan things around and make it the way that I want much, much quicker than working in mono and then panning it around and then having to readjust and then having to add reverbs. I'd rather go straight to the horse's mouth on that one. However, whatever your process is your process. And I'd love to know what it is. And thanks ever so much for watching. Have a marvelous time recording and mixing, and we'll see you all again very, very soon.